Greetings from Austin, Texas. My name is Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Civic Engagement at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at the University of Texas at Austin. This year, we turned 50, and throughout this landmark year, we've been celebrating half a century of impact in the arena. Our original In the Arena series brought together stakeholders and experts in combating the pandemic that we've seen transform our lives in the past couple of months. Today, we launch our summer season. And in this summer season of In the Arena, we turn to our current moment and looking at the civil and voting rights struggles that we're currently engaging with. The series will focus on systemic racism, policing reform, and fair elections, with virtual sessions scheduled bi-weekly on Zoom. We'll talk with policymakers, practitioners, and scholars about the challenges and opportunities in creating meaningful reform and legislation. With me today, I have the immense pleasure of welcoming a dear friend of mine, Dr. Niambi Carter, professor at Howard University, and who just had her book come out, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. Today, we'll be discussing institutional racism, both from a historical context and a contemporary one, and thinking through how policy, how those of us here at the LBJ School and policy schools around the country and practitioners can do something tangible to address systemic racism. One last reminder before I turn it over to Dr. Carter, you'll see in your function, your Zoom function, a Q&A slot. Please go ahead and put your questions in there. We really look forward to engaging with you in the last 20, 30 minutes of this session. So with that, Niambi, I want to start with a historical contextualization of our moment. There have been discussions that the violence toward Black folks and the rollback of rights that we have been seeing over the last several years are eerily similar to those seen during the nadir of race relations in the latter part of the 1800s. So big question for you to get the conversation started is, have we been here before? And are we living a second nadir of race relations in the United States?
Well, thank you for having me. And, you know, this is a big question because as I think about this question, the way I'm thinking of it is, you know, we've never left, right, this period, right? I think we think of race relations in this country as sort of a straight line, and that line always tends to progress. But I think if we've learned anything from Black people's sort of journey in this country is that it's a series of sort of 2 steps forward and 4 steps back sometimes. So I don't think that we're in a second nadir, right? And the nadir was a period right after the Reconstruction, and Rayford Logan, you know, named this period the nadir because this was supposed to be the lowest point of race relations in this country post-enslavement. And I don't view this necessarily as a second nadir in the sense that, you know, I think in many ways we can say Black lives look better than they had at the period that he's writing about, which is the end 1877 till about 1923 or so, depending on the historian that you use. I don't think anyone would suggest that Black people's lives are exactly the same. I think, though, the places where we see a lack of progress and the fact that the conversations that people were having at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century haven't changed very much. Mm-hmm. Black people are still talking about state violence, still talking about vigilantism, still talking about inadequate access to education, inadequate access to healthcare, home ownership, all of these things. So the nadir has really never left us. It just looks different now that you can see, say, Black faces on TV and you have Black elected officials at the national and state levels and other kinds of things that sort of the hallmark of Black progress. But there's still so much to be done. And I think that's the part that is occupying much of our mind.
Right. So there has been progress, but the progress is disparate. It depends on what realms you're looking at where we see that progress.
And absolutely, and as a political scientist, I mean, we both know that when we talk about things like voting rights, for example, that is one contemporary place where we see how imperiled Black lives are, right? I mean, we have, you talk about the LBJ school, right? Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and look at where we are in 2020, where we have a Congress and a Supreme Court, right? Well, Supreme Court that sort of laid the groundwork for gutting of the Voting Rights Act. And we saw the effects of this in 2016, but you also have a Congress who actually has the power to rewrite the imperiled section, right? The question section of the Civil Rights Act, I mean, the Voting Rights Act, excuse me, and they've not done it, right? And they've not done it because there's no will, particularly in the Senate, to see a full sort of measure of Black voting rights in this country. And this is how we end up, in part, where we are right now.
And I would add to that, Niambi, because we just started early voting here in Texas. What's happening at the local level? So you've got the Supreme Court impinging on these rights. You've got Congress not sufficiently protecting them. And then you've got your state and local level election entities making it harder and harder to vote. For example, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and here in the state of Texas, you're not allowed to vote by mail. Right now, this moment, we're having a surge, but because I want to exercise my right to vote, I have to go out there regardless of the fact that all indications say that you should shelter in place. So I think this is what's so serious about thinking about the progression of rights or the inability of rights to move as fast as they can. It's the multiple layers that impinge upon them.
And I think you're exactly right. I mean, not to cut you off, I'm sorry, but I think one of the things, if I can say anything today, is for people to think about their state and local politics much more than we do. We talk a lot about national action and federal action, but state and local politics are where a lot of the things that we care about in terms of like voting rights happen. And so, yeah, just another plug for please pay attention to your state houses.
Yes, and later when we have a little bit of time, Niambi, I do want to talk about the situation in DC and kind of the interesting juxtaposition of you're in DC, the federal seat, but the lack of power, the demographic makeup of the city. But I promise I will get back to that piece. Sure. You wrote a great article for the Washington Post. Okay. One thing I do want to make sure I get to is some of the work we've done and your current work looking at Black-Brown relations. And so when we're in this moment, how do communities of color come together to support the Black community? Because there are core commonalities in terms of suffering from systematic disenfranchisement, racism, repression, but at the same time, there are differences and there are important differences. So how can we see different communities of color come together and not diminish the experience and the history of Black Americans?
Wow, that's a big question. And I think it's a one that we always have to revisit, because one of the things that I've learned or been seeing or paying attention to is the ways that sort of white supremacy can be very intoxicating. Right, that there's a promise potentially for those who are excluded to become included, even on the margins, if there is a sort of exclusion of Black people, quite frankly, right? So white supremacy and anti-Blackness seem to move together. They're not the same thing in my mind, but there is a focus on sort of Blackness as sort of a marker of exclusion and making you sort of forever outsider. And I think for other groups that are sort of racialized in approximation to Blackness, right, or varying degrees away from whiteness, the recognition becomes very clear that if you associate with Blacks, or to the extent that you're seen like Blacks, then you could face similar outcomes. And those outcomes in many respects are not good, not because Black people are bad, but because we have a country that is arrayed against sort of Black survival, to be quite frank. And so I think for these groups that see themselves as sort of apart from Blacks, I would encourage them to imagine them themselves as more akin to Blacks than not. Not because their struggle is the same or because their concerns are necessarily the same, but because what happens to Black people actually does have implications for other communities. And I think there's a way in which we think if we can sort of say that's what happens to those people over there, that the consequences can be confined to that community. But we know that doesn't happen. So whether we're talking about police violence, right? I mean, the surveillance in Black communities imperils, say, Latino communities. Because if those same people are living in close proximity to Black folks, where we know that there is sort of more police surveillance, the likelihood that they could, say, be caught up, particularly if they're not in a safe space in a sanctuary city or locality, increases exponentially. So it actually does matter to you what happens with, say, police surveillance in these same communities. And I would encourage people to think about what it is they're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to achieve great acceptance for yourself, for your children, for your community, can you really achieve that if it's done on the backs of other people, right? And if it means that you have to be implicated in the oppression of other people, right? And I think if that is the case, then you might want to rethink that move, in part because that suggests that your membership in this group is always going to be tenuous, right? Because if it means that I have to exclude these other people so that I can show that I'm sort of like you, then that's not really a way to build commonality, right? That's not a way to build the kind of inclusion that you want, right? If we want a robust democracy, we want a robust democracy. It can't just be for us and the other people who say, yes, that we can be members. So this is a very unclear way of saying that part of what we're trying to build as a human community is a world where people have the full measure of human possibility. If you cannot achieve that without excluding, stepping on someone else, because white supremacy has told you that you're better than those people, then that's probably not the freedom that you want.
It's about having inclusion without a little asterisk on it that says, well, except, or even inclusion. You may have inclusion that's on the books, but in practice you have that exclusion. So it's really an inclusion that is 110% loyal to that word of inclusion. And in thinking about non-minorities, so white Americans, and how they can be part of realizing that promise of a more perfect union. We look at poll numbers, that's what we do. We were just talking about how last week the Washington Post, Ipsos, had a poll talking about the gaps between whites and Blacks on a whole host of items, police reform being one of them. YouGov just did another poll. And I want to throw a couple of statistics out to discuss about how we bridge this gulf, because it is a pretty big gulf. We're talking about here in the recent YouGov poll, 63% of white and 91% of Black respondents say the police treat people unequally based on their race. That's 28 percentage points. And this is right after the George Floyd murder. Another one, whether our country hasn't gone far enough in giving Black people equal rights. 37% of whites say not far enough, while 78% of Black respondents answer that we haven't gone far enough. That's a 41% gulf, Niambi. So in terms of reaching that inclusionary state, changing the systemic structures, where do we begin? What do we do?
Well, I think the more interesting number is on the other side of that 37% of white folks who say the country hasn't gone far enough. There are 63% of white people who say the country probably has, right? And that's more troubling because what it says is that people are willing to deny evidence. And to me, a lot of the questions around racial equality aren't about more evidence. We have evidence that Black communities are systematically undervalued. We have evidence that shows that Black people, men and women, make less than their white counterparts. We have evidence that shows that Black people do not have the wealth that their white counterparts have, that they have a shorter life expectancy, right? Even in 2020, right? Than their white counterparts. So this is not an evidence-based question. This really is a will question. And this is a question that white people are going to have to ask themselves, because Black people have been telling you for centuries all of the things that are wrong with this country, right? All of the things and all of the ways that this country actually does not work for its citizens. And white people have said, well, it's working for me and working for the people that I know. And so it must be fine. And even for the white people who it's not working for, right? They're saying, you know what, but I'm still white. And so it's okay that I'm poor and I don't have good health care, and that, you know, I'm more likely to end up in prison, right? They're willing to deal with that because, again, the ways in which whiteness is valued in this country, that even when it doesn't serve people well, they'll continue their allegiance to this particular set of ideologies or ideological underpinnings. And part of, I think, the answer to some of this is that white people have not learned or have not figured out that listening to Black people is actually a thing that they should be invested in. I don't know that white people appreciate how well Black people know them, right? I mean, Black people have had to, it's been in our interest to understand white people, because if we didn't, we could very easily end up dead or in some dire straits. And so one of the things that I would say is white people need to listen. The other thing I need white people to do is stop feeling guilty, right? Your guilt does nothing, right? It doesn't change anything, right? It's a way to deflect the conversation, right? It's nothing more disingenuous than like, well, I didn't own slaves. You know, my ancestors came from Ireland. They had nothing to do with this, right? It's not about what you collectively as individuals, I mean, or what you as an individual have or don't have. It's about what a collective of people can enjoy. And right now, right, the research shows that a white man with less education, right, could potentially, right, have more command in the economic sphere than Black people with more education and out the baggage, right, of this particular individual. I'm thinking about the work of Deepa Paja here. And what is that about, right? Like asking those kinds of questions, but we don't need white people to ask questions anymore. Black people have been telling you for centuries what to do, what would be important, what would be valuable. And so I'm just looking at all the protestations over monuments and flags. I have very low expectations, right? That people are going to do what it takes to really move this country forward. Because even as we talk about the founding, that is always a wrought kind of conversation. Because many of those people were slave owners, right? Those same people allow for the importation of slaves to be written into the founding documents. They allow for Black people to be considered 3/5 of a person in their founding documents. So even looking to that for guidance, I think is fraught. But I will say this, and I don't think that perhaps people appreciate this. You know, Black people have believed in those same documents that were problematic for centuries. Right? They've been the ones who've been pushing this country forward. I mean, every inch of progress this country has gotten is because somebody fought for it and died for it. You know, Black people weren't the only ones, but we were, you know, up there front and center. And so, you know, I think we need to even sort of reevaluate and maybe interrogate what these founding documents mean yet again, because the foundation is rocky, right? And it's not as solid as I think some of us take for granted.
I think another piece to this, Niambi, is that we shouldn't view the state of America as mutually exclusive. Like what's good for Black folks, well then that's finite. But rather, I know you've written, and I'm going to quote you here in a piece you recently wrote for The Guardian, consider Black people as canaries in the coal mine. What happens to them in this country matters for everyone. So I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I just really want to underscore that point of what is good for Black Americans is good for Americans. And it's not something that we silo off, but it's something that really is a collective uplift.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, of course, what everyone needs is not going to be the same. But I will say this, Black people, Black Americans are Americans, right? There's a way in which we talk about, we do this with women and we do this with other groups, right? But these are their issues, as if these issues have no meaning to anyone else. And as I said before, you can't sort of confine the consequences to the things that you do, right? So you have, people upset about, these police reform, right? And these calls to defund the police and to think about sort of abandoning prisons in the way that we talk about. And they're upset about those things because they think, oh, that's terrible. These places will become lawless. But that's because of the way we have talked about crime, right? It's urban, i.e. Black or Latino, right? That these people are bad people and the police are right and the police do the right things, right? But Black people have been telling for a long time, actually, this is a problem. And it's a problem because when we talk about the ways in which we do policing in this country, the way that we do incarceration in this country, it also has implications for white people. Right? I mean, the work of Marie Gottschalk and Hannah Walker, right? They show that if we let every Black and Latino person out of prison today, we would still have a prison crisis because they're locking up rural white folks too. So something that we thought was going to manage Black people, right? Manage bad Black people in particular, urban crime, has implications for the rural communities and the suburban communities that we have labeled as white for far too long. In the same way, when we talk about a place like Texas, right, there's no reason that mail-in voting should not be allowed, right? But it's not because we want to discourage Latino and Black voters in that state from participating, but it's going to have effects on white people who are now going to have to go to those same polls and potentially open themselves up to health risks. In the same way that we are opening this country, we opened too early. And we had white folks in Michigan and all these places showing up to state houses with their long guns, not wearing masks, protesting the reopening. But again, part of that was because you thought, well, Black people are dying from COVID, not really white people. So it's okay if we open back up. And now look at what's happening in California, in Texas, in Florida, in Arizona, right? Now we have this crisis yet again. So this is my long way of saying that we can work out all kinds of things on Black bodies, all kinds of nefarious policies on Black bodies. But if you think that the consequences are only going to be suffered by Black people, then you don't really understand how policy works, right? Because these things travel. Mm-hmm. And so what you thought was just going to happen to Black people is going to happen to everyone. I mean, even when we talk about sort of immigration, right? The ways that we conduct immigration policy were largely because of how we wanted to manage the Haitian crisis, right? The so-called Haitian crisis in the 1980s. And now we are still reaping what comes from this kind of racist policymaking. And so we see it again and again and again. And this is not to say all things have to be measured by Black people, but when we look at this country and we think about sort of what this moment is telling us, this is a very clear turning point. Black people are telling you, I can't breathe, literally and metaphorically, not just from a cop putting his knee on your neck, but also because we have poor air quality in our communities, because our communities are hotter, right, than other parts of our geography. So there are lots of issues where Black people have been the front runners, environmental justice, and people are just sort of slow to listen. And this is a moment when we actually have an opportunity that if we pay attention, we could actually do something really transformative here.
And Niambi, on that point, turning to kind of more of the nuts and bolts of policy, there's been a lot of talk about police reform policy, and I'm going to bracket that off because in a couple of weeks we'll be delving into that. But with you, I wanted to talk about the broader portfolio of what policy reform looks like. Mm-hmm. Policy reform that is directed at that systemic racism that has, figuratively kept the knee on persons of color, especially Black Americans.
This is a hard one, right? Because I think, anytime we start rattling off things, you're going to always miss something, right? But we can think about access to healthcare, for example. This is a huge issue that lots of people, particularly Black people, are very sensitive to, right? Because I live in a city where you have two of the Blackest and poorest wards that don't have access to healthcare in their home wards. That should not happen in a city where home values are routinely in the 400,000s, right? People in the district pay exorbitant taxes, but you still have, for many members of this city, places where we don't have access. There are things that we could do in terms of student loan forgiveness, right? When we talk about wealth building, one of the things we always tell Black people to do is get an education. But many Black people get educations and are still paying for their educations. I am, right? And this puts off wealth building for another decade, right? Those critical times. And when I'm at an HBCU, right, where we think about alumni giving and who has the actual ability to donate money. And those things are not as able or not as readily available, those funds, because we have graduates who are Pell Grant recipients, right? Who are, taking out financial aid, right? Taking out student loans and are still paying for those things. So there are a number of places. I mean, even if we think about home ownership, for middle-class Black people who can even obtain a home, right? We still have to contend with algorithms that give out higher interest rates to Black people who have on all markers of income and credit worthiness many of the same things as their peers, but they still get higher interest rates on their mortgages, or the neighborhoods that they choose to live in, right? Or the neighborhoods that they can afford, even with their middle class checks, are systematically undervalued because they're majority Black communities. These are the kinds of things that we have to be thinking about. Even maternal health, right? Why is it the case that Black women more often die giving birth or postpartum? Why is that happening? Is it something about the way we're not training our medical professionals? Is it something about the way that we think about Black women, right? And Black girls and our health and our ability to be compliant, right? With health directives, or something, larger than that. We have to think of all of the things, and they are going to be numerous. And I will also say, if we're also being serious about these things, we have to also think about the most marginal folks in Black communities, trans people, for example, whose life expectancies are woefully, woefully short, right? Those are the kinds of places that we need to start. I argue, if we're going to talk about taking all of this seriously, we need to start with the least of us, right? The Black people with the least resources, the least skills, the least ability to mobilize, the people that we don't think of, right? When we talk about this Black community, if we're going to really be serious about making real strides towards a more equitable country, a more just country.
And I want to touch on our discussion about federal versus state versus local level, because I know we've talked about something as localized as bail bond reform, mm-hmm. or who sits on your juries, jury selection. So I think that sometimes when people hear, how can we affect systematic policy change that will affect our systemic racism, that will put a dent in it, it's not just about, a big congressional level voting rights act. That we need, and we need more of that, but it's not saying that without that, there can't be more change affected at your local level, at your county level, at your state level. So I think that for those of us here who are teaching future policymakers, it's about saying small steps can build up to bigger ones.
Absolutely.
So don't hold out for the big congressional reform, because I don't know when that's coming.
Right. But I mean, but like you said, all the things that I talked about, we can think about locally. So we could think about decriminalizing drug possession, right? Marijuana possession, right? That's nothing but, you know, a swipe of the pen, really, in many local communities. We certainly can think about decriminalizing sex work, right? Where we find many trans youth and trans young people being caught up in the criminal justice system because some of them have to resort to sex work because of their lack of access to resources. We can think about greater access to community mental health services. I mean, that was something where my mom got her start in community mental health, but we largely abandoned that as a model to assist our most vulnerable community members. But again, that can happen at the local level, at the county level. That does not require federal intervention. I mean, the ways that we fund schools, that is absolutely a local decision that we can make. And you talked about jury selection. That's one of the ones that I've been thinking about a lot. It's like, why is jury selection tied to your voting right? Right? It shouldn't be. And it shouldn't be tied to your voter registration, but that's often how we pick jury pools, which is why we see these lopsided juries in communities and communities that can be especially diverse, but the jury pools aren't very. So we can think about different ways of doing this. I mean, even when we think about health provision, right? I don't know if you've seen this in your community, but I know in my local community, right? People can go get COVID tests at a fire station. So there could be probably a number of other those kinds of health outreach things that can happen as a community that don't require federal intervention. And I think we have fetishized the federal government because, at least where Black people are concerned, the federal government usually was a remedy to many of the things that we were concerned about, like voting rights, civil rights enforcement, etc. But that's less true. We actually have a government right now that is quite hostile, especially like a Department of Justice, right? Department of Homeland Security, right? When we're talking about ICE and other orgs, those agencies are not really all of that open, right, to the things that people are talking about, like consent decrees and other kinds of oversight of police departments. But we can think about Minneapolis, you know, Camden and these other localities that have taken some bold steps to reforming some of these institutions and think about doing it differently. And I don't think reform was the right term, right? I think we need to generate new modes of being, because reforming what is leaves the foundation intact. And it doesn't really change what might be on the other side of that. And that's what we want. We want different outcomes, right? And I don't want outcomes just for middle class people, right? Or outcomes just for those who are the most able, right, to secure some of these things. Because even when we think about like home buying programs, right, those are pretty ubiquitous across the country. But who can afford to buy a home? You still have to have some money somewhere. Like those things don't really get at the heart of these kinds of questions. But I think you're absolutely right that what your local community controls is vast and you can actually do something.
Change. All right, I know we have a number of questions in the Q&A. I want to get to two last questions and then I will open it up. The first is this time different, Niambi? Will the summer of 2020 be viewed in history as a turning point in race relations here in this country?
I don't mean to laugh because it's not
It's a light question. Sure.
No, it's not funny. It's a really serious question. I'm laughing because I want to believe that the summer of 2020 will be different. We've never had a pandemic, right? Like this is something that's new in our lifetimes. We've never seen this. So I think between the pandemic, between the tanking economy, there are a lot of people who are figuring out what Black people and others have already known, right? And I'm hoping this time will be different because people have to stop and people have to sit still a little bit in ways that they haven't in years prior. But I think we thought 1965 would be different, and then 1968 would be different, and that all these years would be different. So if I'm using history as a teacher, I don't know, right? I don't know. I think, one of the things that can't be, though, and what has to be different, I think, is that there have to be other people in the fight. It can't just be on Black people, right? People are tired and people get exhausted. It has to be a real community effort to participate, and not just let Black people be the ones, rattling the saber and saying, hey, acquiesce to our demands, listen to us, and take this seriously. It needs to be other people out there, because this is not, like you said, this is not just a Black problem, even though Black people are suffering disproportionately from some of the things that we've talked about. It's an all of us kind of problem. And this is not to do the kumbaya, all lives matter, because that's not what I'm talking about. But what I am saying is that, we need white people who are affected by, that image of that elderly man in Buffalo being pushed down by the police and his head bleeding, to keep that same energy when Black people tell you, oh yeah, these police are out here brutalizing us. When Native American people tell you, these police are brutalizing us. When Latino people are saying, these police are brutalizing and harassing us, we need you to keep that same energy for those communities, right? When that happens. And so I think 2020 is different now because of COVID, but I don't know what happens when outside opens back up, right? When we can resume a semi-normal life again, what happens? Because I think we have to, this is not the time to let up, right? This is not the time to say, okay, well, we've gotten a few indictments, or we've gotten a few concessions from local policymakers, right? This is, punch the gas time. So it could be different. I hope it's different. And I hope that the people who are at the forefront of trying to create this new space seek elective office, right? Seek spaces on school boards and other local offices, and really try to create that space that they want, and think about the things that we care about, like legislating and governing differently than our predecessors, instead of trying to put a Band-Aid on it, really sitting with our discomfort and trying to figure out radical new ways of addressing that, rather than doing the same old thing again. It could be, I guess is my answer. It could be different. I hope it's different.
Well, I gave you a large time frame to work with. So let me give you a shorter one, Niambi, to end, because I can't have any conversation without talking about politics in the horse race. And so in looking to the 2020 election, excuse me, we're 124 days away, but who's counting? What is the electoral impact of this summer, of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Ahmaud Arbery, of David McAtee? What is this impact 124 days from now?
Oh gosh, I think it can be, if we're looking at what's been happening across this country, people are motivated in ways that they have not been. People are standing in line for hours to vote. I think that there's a determination that we have not seen in a long time in this country. And it's really, it's heartbreaking that people, it's criminal actually, in my opinion, that people have to wait in line for 5 and 6 and 10 hours to vote. But it is also, awe-inspiring that people's commitments to their votes have been seen in ways that we haven't seen in a really long time. So I think this moment, folks are emboldened. And I think folks are paying attention to how fragile our institutions are, even voting. Yeah, you may not exercise your right to vote. That's your preference. That's your prerogative, right? You have a number of reasons why you won't. But I think people recognize now the stakes, and being lackadaisical or even flippant, because yeah, it's easy to be cynical about these institutions. I totally get it. But when you recognize that those institutions aren't cynical about you, they recognize your power. Otherwise, why would they be rushing to keep you, right, from exercising your right to vote? Because they recognize your power. And they recognize that without you, that with you in the mix, they lose. So I think this year, in 124 days from now, right, that we actually will see record levels of turnout. Because if it wasn't important for Black people, for Latino people, for Asian people to vote, then there would not be all these efforts to prevent those same communities from turning out. So I hope Black people are there in numbers we haven't seen before. We know Black turnout is high and has been trending high for a number of years. I hope we can see rebounds in that turnout that was lost in 2016. I hope Biden and the Democrats do their jobs and give people a reason to vote. It can't just be because the other guy's so bad. You actually have to give people a reason, something to vote for. And I hope people are also thinking about, again, their state houses, those down ballot races, because though, even if you don't vote for the president, vote for those down ballot races, because those things make a lot of difference in your everyday life. Yes. But remember, there's likely to be a Supreme Court justice or two this round. So, and also all of the other judicial appointments that can come out of this. So we might be wanting, I think people are seeing the connectedness of November to the rest of the life that they want to have.
Well put. Well put. All right, I am going to step back for now. I'm going to read a couple of questions here from our Q&A. Let me start with Cole Meyer, who gave us our first question, which is, how do you challenge a system that will ultimately resort to extreme militarized violence to maintain its dominance, even if there is a broad intersectional movement of resistance? And I think before handing it off to you, Niambi, I think it's interesting to also see the historical context in that. And even though we didn't see the weaponry we see today, if we think about in the 1800s and even in the mid 20th century, there were militarized movements for the technology that we had then.
Mm-hmm. You know, this is a really important question. I think a good question. I mean, no one said that this was going to be an easy fight. And you brought up the militarization. I mean, I live in DC, where we are not a state. And we have a president who has actually said, you know, he wants to take over police operations and federalize police operations in this city. And, you know, as a citizen of the district, but also as an American, it's like, wow, right? We see this moment of attempting to deploy the military against its own citizens just for a show of force. I don't know what that looks like, right? I mean, we certainly don't expect that the system that we have currently to acquiesce to demands easily. And if they do, we should always probably be looking sideways, because there's something that they're getting out of it. That's my general sense, right? Co-optation is a really great way to preserve institutions. So I don't know what that would look like. I mean, I know that we have often romanticized activism, and in the sense that we thought about these grand moments, right? Like we see the March on Washington and see these grand moments. But we also remember that there was Bloody Sunday getting here, right? Like there were these other smaller moments, right? The Montgomery bus boycott, which are not sexy and are not fun. They are protracted. They are dangerous, right? You know, what precedes the Voting Rights Act of 1965, are the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson and James Reed. And before that, the 4 little girls. So it's a lot of potential loss of life here that is likely to happen. We've seen people die during this moment. Rayshard Brooks, David McAtee, right? We have seen people dying as we are protesting police violence. So I don't know if there's a way to prepare for it. I would just say that if anybody is protesting at all, should be aware and prepared for the fact that violence could actually meet you, not because you've invited it, but because the very act of protest in many cases is seen as threatening to the state. I mean, we've seen it here, we've seen it all over this country. Just because we have non-lethal weaponry, we should not believe that you can't die from rubber bullets, right? That you can't die from pepper spray if you're an asthmatic or someone who's compromised, their respiratory system is compromised. So, you know, I don't have an easy answer to that, but recognize that movements and protests are not without danger, quite frankly.
As we saw here in Austin,
Yeah.
Niambi, with the young man hit by the rubber bullet.
Yes.
So there's one question related back to something that you said earlier about white guilt. I think it's a bit of a clarification question from Ileana Gill. When you speak of white guilt, what is your opinion on Shelby Steele's book, White Guilt?
I haven't read Shelby Steele. I don't read Shelby Steele. I don't think about Shelby Steele, to be quite frank. I don't know what his argument is, so I'm not going to pretend to speak on it. But my sense is that for me, and this is just for me, when I see people talking about the guilt they feel, I'm like, for what? I mean, it's a wasted emotion. I don't need you to feel guilty. I need you to do the right thing, right? I don't need you to take up, the emotional part, right? Because to me, what you're looking for from me is absolution, and I can't give you that, right? I won't give you that. That's not for me to dispense. But feeling guilty is, to me, a wasted emotion. You want somebody else to tell you not to feel guilty, and then you can feel better about yourself, right? Like, I feel remorse. I'm a good person. Okay, well, that's fine. Well, I don't need you to just feel remorse so you can feel like a good person. I need you to say, okay, now, what can I do to be of assistance? How can I help? Even if it don't have to be any grand gestures, right? But if you work in, say, an academic department, and you see that people are using words like fit and rigor, right, to describe someone else's work and tell them whether, and deciding whether they're worthy for tenure or not, I need you to speak up and question that. I need you to be an actual ally. Don't pat me on the shoulder and tell me afterwards, like, I voted for you for tenure, but it didn't work out. I need you to be an advocate in the room and use your power for something. So feeling guilty to me is useless. It's a shorthand way of saying, I feel this thing, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not really trying to do anything. So pat me on the head and tell me I'm one of the good ones, and I can go about my way and feel good about, being white again, right? So that's what I mean by white guilt. It's like, it's not a requirement. I just need you to say, okay, I recognize that this thing has happened. There are these unearned privileges. It's a fact of the life that we live right now. But it doesn't have to be a fact moving forward if we start, becoming important to the people, or advocating for the people that we need to help advocate for, or with, is more important in those moments. So don't tell me about your feelings after you've helped participate in some racist happening. Like, I don't care. I'm sorry, that was probably a little flippant, but
hey, this is a conversation to have, a real and honest dialogue. That's
sort of my feeling about, white guilt. It's like,
and this is what this space is about. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, a little bit more kind of in terms of the space that we're in, Niambi, as professors. What advice do you have for young scholars who are anxious to make a difference in their community, state, and country?
Wow. I would say do the work that's important to you, right? I think that's probably paramount. Don't let other people tell you that nobody cares about this, or this is not important, or it's not useful, right? If you're talking about these communities of people, nobody cares, right? Write the work that's important to you. Make that work accessible to as many communities as you can. So that might mean writing an op-ed or doing a blog post. And then I will also say, think about your skills and the skills that you have and how you may be able to help others with that skill. So maybe you become a mentor for youth, or if you don't want to do that, maybe you help an organization that's getting off the ground, like write copy for their website, right? I mean, there are all of these little ways that we can participate. If you live in a locality with commissions, right? So say you want to do something a little more front facing or public facing, you can get on many of those commissions. They're not offices that you have to run for. They're things that you apply to and you're officially an appointee. If you have something like that in your community, you can participate on that. It's usually voluntary, doesn't pay you, but you might actually get something of value out of it. I would also say, if you're thinking about being a local office holder, that's also possible. We have, these small elected officials in our communities, part of neighborhood commissions, essentially. They're about their community. They represent a small area, their neighborhood. They're usually winning elections with a few hundred votes. So this is not a heavy lift. I don't know if you all have anything like that in your locality, but that's another possibility. I think people often see, our academic work is only taking place in the buildings and with other scholars, but there are so many ways you can use your skills to uplift and assist the communities that you care about. And I was saying, if you're an activist and you're of an activist bent, that's great. And if you're an academic moving in academic and activist circles, the best way we can do is listen. What do they want or need us to do, right? And sometimes that might just be nothing but showing up.
So our last question here, but before we wrap it up, comes from Claire Kramer. She says, hello from an old friend from Duke. Implicit bias has had profoundly pernicious effects in hiring, lending, and investing. Have you seen any promising practices that can help combat implicit bias? So interestingly enough, now talking about the other Shelby brother.
Yes. So I will be honest that that's not an area that I spend a lot of time in, but I do think one of the things that we can all be mindful of is that, while a lot of this stuff is automated, we have to be thinking about who is creating the algorithms and what they're putting into those algorithms that make these outcomes, because computers don't do this, right? People do. And so I think that there's been, at least from the little bit of stuff I've been paying attention to, more attentiveness to how we are deciding like who is credit worthy and how this happens. And I would even say, if we're thinking about, this moment that we're in and we want to be serious about sort of distribution of wealth and how we generate and create wealth, I mean, I would suggest, I know this is a little far afield for many people, but as we talk about reparations, which was all the rage last fall when we were in primary cycle, where everybody in the Democratic side was talking about reparations. One of the things that we could talk about is, sort of the unequal access to the GI Bill, and the ways in which Black soldiers of a particular period were prevented from taking full advantage of that, even in home lending as veterans. And so if we thought about that as a potential avenue, I think that could be useful. I know here there are other programs that are attempting, I think like FHA and some others, to bring more middle income buyers into the market and assisting. But, it's been, I think this time has been a little better than it was at the last economic downturn when we saw Black people losing their homes at alarming rates. And that was under Obama, right? So this is not a partisan issue, but I think that's a really important area. And there are some folks who are doing that work. I unfortunately do not, but I think that there's possibility in rethinking and reimagining how we determine credit worthiness. And even as we talk about Black entrepreneurship, right? People talk about empowerment zones, but there's no evidence that empowerment zones are actually working really well and may not be serving the minority communities they think, because if you can get a Black person on your board or something like that, you technically, I think, could be considered a minority business. Not exactly sure, but I think that's kind of how it works. So it's a fairly loose set of arrangements that are sort of under the guise of promoting minority business, but may not actually do that. But I think that's an important area that we'll need to spend more time in.
Before I let you go, Niambi, I want to make a plug for something that speaks to a lot of what we've been discussing, which is the census. And the census may not sound very sexy, but it is one form of activism because it really ensures that our underserved communities get the resources that they need, namely in terms of hospitals and clinics and schools, transportation, and more. So we have seen that this has been a year during which the census has been out in the field during a pandemic. So we know that numbers are low, so all of us need to do our part to make sure that the census is completed. The deadline has been extended to the 31st. I know I'm preaching to the choir in talking to y'all here about filling out the census. I'm sure most of you have. So my ask is that you figure out ways to engage with your networks, with stakeholders that you work with to make sure that all are counted in the census so that we have both the voting rights and the economic rights that we're entitled to. With that, I want to give a very, very huge thank you, gracias, to Dr. Niambi Carter for joining us today. And I want to invite you all to check out this session. We'll have it up online on the In the Arena page for the LBJ School, along with the supplementary readings that go with our deeper dive. That should be up by Friday afternoon at the latest. And then please tune in 2 weeks from now. We won't be having our normal Wednesday in the Arena. It's actually going to be on Thursday the 16th, where we're going to be digging into voting rights and the challenges before us and how we negotiate them. So with that, I'm signing off from Austin. Much love to you, Niambi Carter, in Washington, D.C., and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.